This is the story of Harry Hopkins, also known as Hatchet Harry. Now you have to understand I've been around for a long time. I've heard many stories. My first year at camp was 1958. My first year working Old Timers Week was 1960. At that time there were people around who came up Old Timers Week who were original campers. I listened to their stories, I talked to them, I asked questions. I put together a number of stories for camp. One of them involves Hatchet Harry. In 1908, when the camp began, there was one wooden building. It was called the Wildmere Building, before Westinghouse took over. As the years went along, it became evident that another building was needed. In fact, two more buildings were needed, because everyone was living in tents. One was an office for the director, who was Jack Burns in 1918, and the other was an infirmary for people who were sick. So in 1919, Jack Burns decided, with the permission of the camp committee, to build some buildings at camp. And he rode across the lake to the cabin of Harry Hopkins, who was also known as Hatchet Harry, because he used a hatchet to do a lot of his building. He was very adept at using a hatchet or an axe. He rode across the lake, went to the cabin, knocked on the door, and the door opened. A big man appeared with a hatchet attached to his side. "What can I do for you?" "Mr. Hopkins?" "Yes. My name is Jack Burns. I'm from the camp. I'd like to talk to you about hiring you to build some cabins at camp for next year." Harry Hopkins said, "Come right in, Mr. Burns." They sat down at a table, and Jack Burns explained to Harry Hopkins that he wanted two cabins built at camp. One was going to be his office, one was going to be an infirmary. So they agreed upon the price, and Jack Burns was going to bring plans to Harry Hopkins by the end of the summer of 1919, and Harry would work on it in the fall and the spring of 1920 and be ready for 1920. At the end of the summer of 1919, Jack Burns rode across the lake again, went to Harry's cabin, and presented him with plans for his office and for the infirmary. The plans that Jack Burns drew up called for one cabin for him and another cabin for an infirmary. And he presented them to Harry Hopkins. They agreed upon the price, and Harry said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. It'll be ready for you in 1920 when you come back to camp." In 1920, Jack Burns came back to camp a little bit early to see the buildings. He was very happy with the way his building turned out, but he was not happy with the way the infirmary turned out. He had a second floor, which was impossible to get to, and was not in the plans. He rode across the lake to Harry Hopkins, and he said, "Mr. Hopkins, I'm very happy with the cabin you built for me, but the infirmary is not the way I had anticipated it." And Harry said, "Well, you never know when you need a second floor. Trust my judgment." And Jack Burns said, "No, I'm not going to pay for it. It's not the way we specified it. You didn't do it the way I wanted it." And Harry got mad. He said, "Go away. I don't want your money for anything, and curses on you." So Jack Burns rode back to camp, and the summer went along. One night during the summer of 1920, Jack Burns was working late in his cabin, and he noticed that next door in the infirmary there was a light on, and you could see something moving or somebody moving around in the building. There wasn't supposed to be anybody there, and we went out of his cabin and stood in front of the infirmary. He noticed a light on the second floor, and he saw shadows moving up on the second floor. And then the light went out, and that was the end of it. He thought he was imagining things. He went back to his cabin and went to sleep. The next day, the camp was going to be visited by a group of Boy Scouts from the town. They were going to launch their canoes down the canals, come around in a semicircle, and land on the dock. They launched their canoes, and as they came around in a semicircle to land on the dock, one of the Boy Scouts foolishly stood up in the canoe, and he fell over, and he hit his head on the rocks as he approached the camp, and he was killed. It was a tragedy, but Jack Burns remembered the curse of Harry Hopkins and thought it might have something to do with the light he saw the night before in the infirmary. A few years later, something similar happened. Jack Burns was working late in his cabin. He noticed a light on in the infirmary. He went out and he thought he saw something moving upstairs on the second floor. And then the light went out, and that was the end of it. The next day, a group of kids from camp were going to go across the lake and camp out. The leader took the kids down the road. They walked around canals to where the campsite is, a little bit beyond that, and they went to sleep. About midnight, they were awakened by a man coming through. "What are you doing here? What are you doing on my property?" It was Harry Hopkins. Sir, we didn't think it was your property, we thought it was camp property. Get out of here, get out now. So the leader of the group apologized to Harry Hopkins. He gathered their stuff and they walked back to camp. When they came back to camp, they discovered that one of the boys on the hike had not come back with them. So the leader went back with some of the other boys to find him, and they found him dead in his sleeping bag with hatchet marks on his face. It was a terrible tragedy, and Jack Burns was very upset by it. Went across the lake to confront Harry Hopkins on it, but Harry wasn't there. It was never solved. Now, I told the story about Harry Hopkins, Hatchet Harry, to a group of boys, I think it was 3B cabin, a number of years ago, and we were sitting down near where the Gaga pit was. I told them the story, and then we went back to the cabins, which was the old infirmary and the Jack Burns cabin those days, and found a hatchet buried in the side of the house. And we saw a light on the second floor of the old infirmary. We saw something moving around there, but we didn't go in. Sent the boys back to sleep, and I went back to sleep myself. But I remember the curse that if the light was on and something was in the building, something bad would happen the next day. The next day there was water skiing, and I remember Ramey Lepper was driving the boat. I say that because she's a very careful driver. And she's driving the boat. She had Anthony Grealish as one of the people water skiing, and a terrible accident happened. Anthony was badly hurt by a freak accident water skiing. And we took him to the hospital, and I remember the curse of Hatchet Harry. I remember seeing the lights on the night before when I told the kids the story. Anthony Grealish was part of the cabin that heard the story. And I said, if he's well, I'll never tell that story again, because the curse comes true. Anthony came back from the hospital. He'd hurt his back. It wasn't as serious as it looked, but he was all right. So I breathed a sigh of relief, and I resolved never to tell the story again, as long as the old infirmary was there, and the Jack Burns cabin was there separately. Some years later, we renovated the cabins. We sort of tore down the insides and connected the two and made it a modern place. I felt I was released from that vow of not telling the story. But what happened to Hatchet Harry? I discovered that he was living up in the cook's house, the second floor window. And as I take the golf cart up the hill, up the inner path, and we reached the cook's house, we looked up in the window, and I yelled Harry's name, and his face would appear in the window. Many of the boys I took with me can vouch for that. I yelled, Harry, Harry, and his face would light up in the window. And he was there for a while. Sometimes there when we came up, sometimes he wasn't there. We never went upstairs to find out where he was in the cook's house. But one day, some years ago, we discovered that the room was empty. And we invited, Josh Dale and I invited boys to take a look in the room to see where Harry had lived. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, we met. We went up to the White House, cook's house, and Josh took him in, groups of 3, to the room. Found some wires where he had rigged up some lights, but no sign of Hatchet Harry. A couple of years ago, I was told that Hatchet Harry's boat was down in a little swamp area across from the road that never ends. So I surmised that Hatchet Harry was living out in the woods somewhere, down the road that never ends, which is across from the baseball field, adjacent to the soccer field. We didn't go down that road because it was flooded. We could only go down at a certain point. Went down with some kids one night and yelled out, Harry, Harry, you out there? No answer. Harry, Hatchet Harry. A light appeared in the distance and some moaning. He was out there, but he didn't come to us. We didn't go to him. And the fact that we couldn't go across the bridge because it was flooded meant that we couldn't see him, he couldn't see us. I go up there every so often. The boat is still in the little swampy area. He's out there somewhere, which is why we tell boys if they get upset about camp, don't run away, because there are people out in the woods that want to get them. The camp is safe as long as you're with counselors, as long as you stay in camp. But don't go wandering around by yourself. Harry Hopkins is around there somewhere. He's got his hatchet. He's angry at camp. And it's a curse of Hatchet Harry. Thank you.